So now we get back to my recent publication, The Old Testament and God. This is the British SPCK edition, and many of you will have the Baker Academic hardback one, but rather a tome. And we did have one event on this, and this is our second event. And so I just want to remind you, first of all, what we did at our first event. So I commented there, drawing on the work of a Hebrew Bible scholar, Seth Sanders. He makes the point that the literature of the Old Testament, when you read it in the context of the ancient Near East, it is a literature of unprecedented communicative power. That in this regard, there is nothing comparable in the context of the ancient Near East. And, the thing that I want to ask is, well, why do we not experience the Old Testament in this way? Now, when I say why do we not experience the Old Testament in this way, I'm referring both to mainstream Old Testament studies, as well as to evangelical interpretation and the preaching of the Old Testament in the church. I think it's quite a shock to many of us to realize that when you position the Old Testament in its context of the ancient Near East, that it is a book of unprecedented communicative power. Now, the Old Testament emerges out of God living amidst a nation, Israel. He sets up his residence there, and he literally and truly lives in their midst. And the residue, if you like, of that sojourn amidst this people is the literature of the Old Testament. And so one way to start getting excited about all of this is to imagine, could you imagine if you could get hold of the literature resulting from God living over centuries amidst a particular nation? My goodness me, we'd be out to the bookshops as fast as we could get to them to get this literature. Well, that is what you have in the Old Testament. So this project of mine is an attempt to do an Old Testament parallel to Tom Wright's work without pretending for a moment that I'm comparable to Tom Wright. But it's a quest to find a way of reading and listening to the Old Testament so that we start to hear it in its full acoustics. And we start to hear it as a literature of unprecedented communicative power, which has immense things to teach us about all aspects of life. I argue in this first volume, and God willing, there are 3 to follow, 3 volumes, and the agreement with the publishers is they will not get bigger, like Tom's books got progressively bigger. Personally, I find that very reassuring because this is quite large enough. But what I argue in this ground-laying first volume is that if we are going to hear the Old Testament in this way, we need a paradigm shift for Old Testament study. We need to rethink Old Testament study, drawing on all the strengths of the history of such interpretation, but finding a new way to listen to the Old Testament today so as to hear it in all its unprecedented communicative power. Now, in part 2 of the book, I identify 3 aspects of Old Testament texts that I argue need close attention if we are to hear the Old Testament, namely the literary dimensions of Old Testament texts, that these texts are literary texts. Secondly, the historical dimension, and there are 2 aspects to this. The one is, of course, and Chip will flag this unrelentingly, I guess, is that these are texts written in ancient Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic. So clearly they are historical texts. You can't read them, actually, if you don't study ancient Hebrew and a smattering of Aramaic. Many of the Old Testament texts are also historical in the sense that they claim to speak about things that actually happened. These are the vast historical narratives of the Old Testament, and so they have this particular historical dimension in a way that the Psalms a lot of the time, or Proverbs or Song of Songs, do not have. The third element that I argue in texts of the Old Testament that we need to attend to very closely is the kerygmatic. Now, some people refer to this as the theological dimension. I prefer the term kerygmatic because kerygma is about the message of the text. Now, my argument is that such is the nature of the Old Testament as God's word for God's people and God's world, that in Old Testament texts, it's invariably the kerygmatic that is the dominant one of these three. So invariably the literary and the historical are subsidiary to the kerygmatic dimension of the text. Okay, and this is important in all sorts of ways, because if we want to hear the message of these texts, well, they are texts with a powerful message, and then we need a hermeneutic which doesn't stop with literary analysis or stop with historical analysis, but all of that is in the service of listening for what these texts have to say. Now, in part 3, I move on to the importance of the ancient Near Eastern background for understanding the Old Testament. And what I do here, I think it's about 9, 10, or 11 worldviews of surrounding nations. I attempt to analyze, and to analyze the worldview, I try and look at the worldview through the main symbols of the worldview, not just their beliefs, but symbols, rituals, as well as beliefs, following Tom Wright, in order to get a sense of the frameworks of the worldviews around Israel that she was aware of, engaged with, involved with, and is clearly again and again responding to in the literature of the Old Testament. Now, this first volume is called God and the Old Testament, and the series is called Old Testament Origins and the Question of God. And at the heart of this project is what happens to Old Testament scholarship if we take God and divine action, God's action in the world, seriously. Now, any of you who have done mainstream Old Testament studies will know that by and large, this is taboo in mainstream Old Testament studies, and contemporary biblical studies has been hugely shaped by an approach which exempts us from taking God seriously in our reading of the Old Testament. So I'm trying to row completely against the stream in that regard, and to say, you know, there are very good reasons to take God's action in the world seriously, to assume that God is the living God. And if that is true, how would that reshape, not simplistically, and not ignoring all the gains of Old Testament study, but how would it reshape the project of Old Testament study in the service of helping us to hear the Old Testament in its full acoustics? Now, I'm so glad Chip is with us, because by far the hardest part of the book for me to write was part 3, the worldviews of the ancient Near East. I was a visiting scholar at Trinity University for a year leading up to the pandemic, and colleagues there were unbelievably helpful. And then Chip was one of the kind people who read a draft of this part of the book and sent me a whole host of very helpful comments and saved me from some important blunders, although I take full responsibility for what remains in the book. Now, there are at least three reasons why I found it so hard. One of which may be I'm just not as clever as Chip, which I entirely go along with. But these are the three reasons. I'm not trained like Chip as an ancient Near East specialist. Secondly, we live in a day where ancient Near Eastern studies have become more and more specialized. The amount of literature in tiniest areas is just almost overwhelming. And so it was really important for me at Trinity University to go to a Sumerian expert and say to him, please just tell me how to get into this literature, and so on and so forth. Now, Chip, you are, and then thirdly, even when I found the right literature, I discovered that most authors of ancient Near Eastern studies were often not asking or addressing directly the worldviewish questions I was asking. So that's really hard, because you're looking for an answer to worldviewish type questions, and a lot of the time the discourse is not wrestling with those questions directly. Now, Chip, you are an ancient Near Eastern specialist. Can you tell us briefly about yourself? Yeah, and I've given you a list of things to tell us about.
Yeah, Craig, thank you for that. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, it's good to be with you. It's good to have participated in, to some degree, the sort of final stages of the book, and to give some feedback to you, Craig. It was an honor to do that. And it's good when we have friends that can watch our back in many different ways. And so we're here for one another. And I think that's a testament to your own thinking about these things. And so I always want to be a participant in that as well, because I know that oftentimes I leave my back unprotected as well. So we're here for you and for each other. So thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity to be here as well and talk about these important issues, and maybe even be something new for many of the people here to gather to think about ancient research studies in this way, and what does it have to say to us more broadly. So, but yeah, you asked me just to give a brief introduction. So Chip Hardy is my name. I teach at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina. There I serve as associate professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages. So mostly my expertise is in ancient Near Eastern studies. That's my training, and my sort of scholarly bend is towards that direction, and in particular thinking about how grammar plays a role, and how we engage with language plays a role in that element of the cultural realities of the Bible and its own setting, and then going forward into modern times. So it's pretty broad in that way. I happen to be here in Cambridge, not too far from Craig at this time, spending my sabbatical here, affiliated with FAMES, the Faculty of Ancient and Eastern, Middle Eastern Languages here at the University of Cambridge. So very happy for those folks. And thank you to Tyndale House for letting me crash their conference room. So if this room looks familiar to some of you, that's the reason why it does. So anyway, glad to be here. Happy to be participating. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And we're delighted to have you in Cambridge. And I love the acronym FAME.
Yes.
The Kirby Lang Center needs to think of some such acronym.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Someone can think about that. KLC, what you can make out of those letters.
Well, the one thing we do tell people is that anyone who abbreviates us as KFC gets excommunicated immediately. So that we'll have to think of a different acronym. Now Chip, this volume, the thing I found most challenging, but also utterly exhilarating, was immersing myself in ancient Near Eastern studies. And the more I got into it, the more I found resonances and parts of the Old Testament, coming alive to me in ways I couldn't have imagined otherwise. Now, could you tell us a bit about the state of ancient Near Eastern studies today? Amongst other things, it seems to me to have become not only highly specialized, but divorced from Old Testament studies. In your view, if you could comment on this, how might ancient Near Eastern studies be better leveraged for Old Testament interpretation And are there good examples of such work?
Yes, I think so. And I think the answer to both those questions is yes, just in brief, but also in sort of more details. I think it's important to understand this sort of historical framework of the study of the ancient Near East in reference to the Old Testament. And so let me just take us on a quick journey through the last 150 years, if we can. I won't go into the details year by year, but just a quick overview, and some of the audience here could probably do this better than me, but I'll just kind of give you my assessment. 150 years ago, there were many different sites in the ancient world that were being uncovered in various different ways. And from that, we could call it excavation in a loose sense, but for many of my modern archaeologist friends, they would just call it this sort of uncovering, just kind of throwing at the ground and seeing what came out. And some of the things that came out very early on are well known to us in Old Testament studies. Things like the stories of floods and gods and peoples that maybe we had only had hints about in the Old Testament. We learned that there were Hittite people in a certain part of Anatolia, modern day Turkey. We learned of a flood story or multiple flood stories, very famously there in the decipherment of cuneiform. Also, we have similar things going on a few years before with the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs as well, very famously. So the field began around that time, late 1800s, let's just say, for a broad spectrum, the first 50 years there to think about, and from that, many connections started to emerge between the Bible and the ancient world. Connections that now seem almost silly. The fact that there were gods and they were inhabiting these spaces and temples, and there were sacrifices and stories of these gods and myths of these gods that sound very similar to the Old Testament stories. Some even using language that was nearly identical, even though obviously they were spoken in different languages, but related languages even were interesting. So we see interesting cultural reality that was overlapping and mapping very similarly. We see interesting narratives and myths that were telling stories of very similar things that the biblical stories were telling about. And so this led us into, as a people, into kind of, I don't know if we call it hysteria, but sort of this all things of love of the Old Testament and the ancient Near East. And so you walk into the British Museum and you see these huge wall art, of palaces from Assyria and gates from Babylon and other places like that. And so not only were people uncovering these things, but they also were in various ways taking them and making museums and other places. And this is kind of the rise of the modern movement of archaeology and the ancient Egyptian studies more broadly. Now, that all went fine and good. And there was a lot of, I don't know, I should be careful here, but a little bit of synergy that was going on between the understanding the culture of the Bible and this very interesting new thing that was being discovered in the ancient world. And so it was motivating a lot of different discoveries, and a lot of things were coming to light for those of us in the West and kind of Eurocentric world and the Americas as well. So much so that a particular individual by the name of Frank Delitzsch, very famously in the early 1900s, gives some lectures at his university in Germany, and created a firestorm. It's called the Babel and Bibble discussion, or Babylon and Bible, if you want to translate it into English. And from that, we sort of saw a parting of ways between biblical studies and ancient Near Eastern studies. Some of that was because Delitzsch himself thought of the Bible as just merely another Mesopotamian story, a Mesopotamian myth was what he would say. And this is falling in line with maybe even people like Velazquez before him as well. And so as a result of that, the study of the biblicists sort of started separating themselves from ancient Near Eastern studies, and maybe more importantly, ancient Near Eastern studies started to separate itself from biblical studies, so that it wasn't seen any longer as merely the handmaiden of biblical studies, but it was in its own right something to be studied and examined. So you might think about this as an early sort of regional studies group or something like that, where, hey, we want to actually have people studying Assyriology from that perspective uniquely, not merely just comment on the Bible, but comment on what are these texts saying in and of themselves. And so we have, and there's other factors that are being involved here as well. We have Edward Said, who's speaking about Orientalism at this time. We have someone like Landsberger, who's also another major player in cuneiform studies, who comes on and says, no, cuneiform needs to be done for cuneiform's sake. And so we need not to be beholden to biblical studies. So much so that there's even a project at the University of Chicago that's launched to not understand ancient Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian in light of the Bible, but rather in its own right. And so they launched this project that was finished just about 10 years ago, about a 100-year project there, to do exactly that. Take these texts for their own value, underneath their own weight. Now, just briefly, I'll fast forward a bit more. In the 20s and 30s, we had another major discovery in the ancient Near East, along the northern coast of modern-day Lebanon, Syria. We see the discovery of this town at Ras Shamra called Ugarit. And there is the discovery of a number of myths that sound very similar to us, the Baal, what's called the Baal cycle, the Baal myth, as well as quite a bit of poetry that sounds a lot like the biblical poetry. And these texts date from the late Bronze Age. And so they date from periods just before kind of the emergence of literary studies in Hebrew as well. So, or literary development in Hebrew as well. So at that time, and what happened then is, because of the familiarity with who Baal was and with this kind of literary style of poetry, we have what's oftentimes called sort of pan Ugaritation or something like that, or Ugaritic studies or something like that, or other people more negatively termed it parallelomania, where everything was seen there was also seen in the Bible, and then this was the way in which we should study these texts. Ugaritic studies as well sort of went through the same process as Assyriology studies in their removing themselves from the Bible. That happened maybe in the 70s or 80s. And then so it itself becomes its own sort of designated field. And so where we come to today in sort of 2023, we find ourselves having had this history of these two studies, or one study which is birthed from another, but then decides it wants to go on its own, much like a child, I suppose. And then, the question now is there a way for that child to return to the fold, or for us to do something good? Once it's now reached maturity, which I think we can say for sure that both Assyriology and the study of Ugarit have reached its maturity, what then is the next step? And I think that is where we find ourselves here in our current moment.
Well, that's just extraordinarily helpful. And just to have the overview of what has got us to the current situation. And personally, my sense is that there's, these disciplines needed to become somewhat independent, but it's probably too disparate now, at least for those of us who are very concerned about the Old Testament. Yeah. Now,
right.
Yeah.
And I think there are some people who've tried to continue to keep their hands in these things, because there has been, especially amongst evangelicals, a sense that these cultures have something to say to us and our understanding of the Bible. It seems like scholars for some time now have been asking these types of questions. And so we can look to projects like the Context of Scripture volumes, which there are now 4 of, that William Halo and then eventually Lawson Younger end up editing, which are an attempt to say, hey, there are literary connections between these different cultures. And here's a way that biblical scholars can be reading this literature and taking it seriously in its own right, as well as thinking about the ways in which it might be speaking to us about how to better understand the biblical text as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Lawson Younger, of course, is at TEDS at Trinity University. So that was one of the scholars that it was fabulous to have access to. Now, Chip, you teach at a seminary, so this question I think you'll be familiar with. To back up a bit, some of us listening might wonder, why do we need ancient Near Eastern studies for biblical interpretation? Don't we confess the clarity of Scripture, that the major truths on the surface and are clear? Now, I don't know if you get asked that at seminary or in churches, but how would you respond?
I would say that I read the Bible quite a bit, and I don't understand a lot of it. So it might be clear, and I think that's the experience of most readers of the biblical text, modern readers of the biblical text, is that yes, we might say it's clear and want to hold on to that doctrine as to say it's clear in its essential teachings about who God is and what does He desire from us, what does He desire from the world, how is He acting in the world. I think those things we can affirm to be true and clear, but it doesn't mean that every text that speaks about those things are clear themselves. In fact, I think Peter said something very particular about the way Paul wrote that wasn't terribly clear either, if I recall that. I have read the New Testament once or twice. So I think that's something that we see even in those writings. So I think clarity is an important doctrine. If we think about clarity from Martin Luther's perspective, if we want to think about like a reformational point, his point was to say that we don't need the magisterium of the popetry in order to set out the terms for how we understand. That's where scriptural clarity or perspicuity comes from a reform perspective. Obviously, people argue that this has been around longer than that, and I think it has different entailments even for us today. But I don't think it means that every scripture is entirely clear to every reader. We don't treat children the same way as we do adults. We don't treat young believers the same way as old believers. The first time you read a text is not the last time you read a text and the best way you understand something. So I think whatever we mean by clarity, we don't mean that everything is just understandable on first glance. That's how
Yeah.
I normally handle it. And then, of course, the other side is to give examples to say, hey, here's some ways in which we have transformed our ideas about the way the biblical text means or what it says or what's its intention or even added multifaceted understandings and interpretations that have opened doors for many people. And I think these type of things are sort of understood by most people. I think the concern, though, and I think the thing that we oftentimes need, and maybe some folks here have addressed this themselves, but that one of the concerns I have, of course, is that we don't we don't create a new magisterium of interpretation that's required then to access the meaning of these texts. That would be a mistake, but it also would be a mistake to make the opposite and say that, well, no, everything's just understandable in your English translation, and then move on from there, right? Because obviously, if we just began to start teaching in Hebrew, this would not be understandable to people.
Yeah, so absolutely, 100%. And I think, missiologists have taught us in particular that God's word is always contextual. I mean, it's the glory of God's revelation, that He doesn't drop some universal truth from heaven, but He, incarnates Himself in the life of a people, and then the Son becomes a first-century Jew. So with the nature of the way God has revealed Himself, I think, as I would say, in the Old Testament, Adonai comes to us clothed in the garb of the ancient Near East. And so we need to understand that particular type of clothing if we are to have a deep encounter with Him. So, yeah. Okay, now, Chip.
And if I could add a note to that, Greg, I think, part of that garb is actually the accommodation to understand who He is for the people. Because if He came and really revealed His transcendent glory to us, we wouldn't even be able to fathom. Just imagine the way Daniel sees God, high and lifted up, and he's stretching for words. Ezekiel's vision of God, the throne, even though it's enculturated as well, he's without words to speak about it. I think Paul does the same thing, and so the ways in which God speaks are a condensation, or coming down, the condescension. There's the word. Thank you. Into our present reality, and part of that condescension is the using of language, of culture, of custom, of even temple practices and cultural realities, in order to tell us what is He like, based on something that we can imagine. Because otherwise, how could we have even imagined this?
Yeah, no, which is actually a very, very beautiful thing. So one of my favorite philosophers, Haman, begins his kind of a commentary meditation on the Bible, God and author, what condescension. And I think that's what you have just led us to. And that means we take the cultural context of God's revelation as seriously as we can and welcome, all these new discoveries and studies. Now, could you give us just a few of your choice examples of how ancient Near Eastern studies illuminates the Old Testament? Now, and you can give us several, or you can take one or two and do them in a bit more detail.
Okay, we'll try to see what we get to here. So let's start with one that may be familiar to us and one that maybe people have heard of before, but I want to think about it at a deeper level. So, and Craig, even in your book, you talk about this, and this is the idea of covenant. Now, the Bible says a lot about covenant in its text, and we know a lot about covenant from the broader ancient Near Eastern culture. And so when we come to the Bible and we say, oh, covenant, okay, what's a modern corollary to covenant? Well, we say, okay, marriage is a modern corollary to covenant. Maybe we see a treaty between two different groups is a modern corollary of covenant on like a national scale. I would argue to say that adoption is another type of modern day covenant. All right. So, and I would ask the question then is, okay, what brings a treaty, a covenant in marriage, and an adoption together underneath the same rubric? And I think if we sat here and talked about it and kind of brainstorm, I think we could come up with a lot of the meanings, a lot of things that we know of from the scriptures. But let me just suggest to you that what we see in the ancient Near Eastern culture is that one of the unifying factors across all covenant language in the Bible is the idea of forming of a relationship. So these are all ways in which a relationship is formed that is a non-native relationship. So it's interesting that the covenant of marriage creates equal partners that mirror sort of siblings, if you will, within a family. It's not a sibling relationship, but it mirrors that, where you have two equal parties underneath a family rubric. Think of something like adoption, where a family adopts a young child, right? This is the relationship building. It's the creation of a non-biological relationship with someone outside of their biology. So it's the mirroring of a relationship of parent to child with someone who's not truly a biological child to create that relationship. Or on a nationalistic level, two nations that have nothing to do with each other now become brothers in their agreement with one another. So they were enemies, and now they've become brothers, let's say. So these are all relationship building realities, and to do that, to build that relationship, requires ritual, time, and shared responsibilities. It's not merely just a contract, right? Marriage is not just a contract. Adoption is not merely a contract. A treaty is not merely a contract. It's something more than that. It creates and instantiates a new reality that wasn't there before. And what we learn from ancient Near Eastern studies is that this seems to be exactly the situation in the ancient Near East. So the gods who were the kings in, let's say, the Levantine area, the time of we think of as modern day Israel, the place in Jerusalem and elsewhere, they were being contacted by the big king in Egypt in the time of the New Kingdom period, during the Amarna text, we know these from, and they address each other as brother. One king, completely unrelated to another, referring to the other king as a brother. Now, sometimes within that relationship, there's a great brother, the truly great king. So there is still a tiered relationship, and sometimes we have older brothers, don't we, Craig, and older sisters, and so there is still that relationship there. But you see that even the language that's used within that relationship, they're not biological brothers. It's not sort of this, Europe in the 1900s sort of where everyone's related to everyone sort of thing. These are completely, different speaking people in different places, and there's animosity between these groups. But yet, because there are covenants that have been formed, there now are these relationships that are built, these familial relationships that have been extended to these different groups. So now when we come to the Bible, and we ask the question of language, like, I am your God and you are my people, we have to ask the kind of question, well, which type of relationship is this? Is this more like the father the child relationship, or is this the brother, or is this the brothers the sibling relationship, or the family or the familial relationship of marriage? And what's interesting is that the biblical texts actually do both, don't they? At times, God says, Israel, you were my bride, and I've taken you in. That's in Ezekiel. At other times, he says, no, no, you are my children, and you can call me father, also in Ezekiel as well. And so we see both of those metaphors, those cultural metaphors, are then brought over into to for God, and God uses them in order to demonstrate that even though there's no biological connection, you were alienated from me. Now you actually become part of my family. And what a great truth we see as well with the supper, where Jesus says, this is the new covenant in my blood, right? Where no longer it's now brother, sister relating to our father. And so we can see how these ancient Near Eastern documents, these ancient covenant documents, can help us understand these relationships better and see how they're, how they're working out in their communities in these different ways. So I think that's a great example, one that's always ready-made. Sandra Richter has a very good book called The Epic of Eden, where she expands on some of these ideas, and I would highly recommend that for all readers. It's a very entry-level meant for all folks of reading the Bible, and highly recommend it, IVP Press. So that's one example. I don't know, do you want to do some more?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely superb. So just three quick comments. The one is just a reminder, we aren't all related in Europe.
just a royalty.
That's a quote. Secondly, I love the idea of someone like you being at fame, and I can call you my great brother. So that's. But then the third thing, which I've followed scholars in arguing for in the Old Testament and God, is that although covenant is pervasive in the ancient Near East, what is unique in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament is a covenant between a God and a whole people. Now, do you think that is correct?
Yeah, I think it is right, because I think many times, at least the language of God and people, so that's nation or people and God, that kind of language I think is exceptional, because I think most of the time we do have sort of relationships claimed between gods and kings, or God, but to have a relationship claimed between God and a whole group of people is a different sort of thing. And I think that speaks a lot to what we see in this literature that we call the Hebrew Bible as well, is that the king obviously has an important role as representative of the people, but it's not all about the king. In fact, it's very critical of the king in many ways.
So this would be, I mean, I think this actually gets us to why you've got a literature with such communicative power, because in ancient Near Eastern cultures, king, god, temple are sort of inseparable. And then you come to Old Testament and you find a literature that's terribly ambiguous about kingship. And then Chris Wright encouraged me to go back and look at Gottfold for ways in which things that in the ancient Near East are applied to the king are shifted onto Adonai, so things like lawgiver and so on and so forth. So I think those are the dynamics that result in a literature of unprecedented power, because it's not scribes just talking to each other. It's suddenly a God in profound relationship, which is what you've just alerted us to, with an entire people.
I think so. And I think also that even the laws themselves are given in such a way as to, I'm going to use a modern term, but don't take it the wrong way, democratize the reality. And we see that throughout the biblical text. Yes, the king has special place, but he doesn't have ultimate place. In fact, it's shocking in the opening pages of the Book of Kings that David is told no, right? And that should be shocking to us, that he's told no by God. How dare God tell the king no? And or how dare he tell the king that he wasn't right in his exertion of power in the taking of this land, or whatever, or the taking of this woman, right? And so I think those show that the king is still underneath the greater lawgiver. And we get some hints of that in something like Hammurabi, where Shamash is giving the law code to the king, who's then presenting it. But it still is something quite different. And I would say that the way in which the text operates then is surprisingly democratized. And I think it has that power because, yes, the priests have a responsibility, but on Passover, the meal is done in the home, right? The instructions in Deuteronomy are to the father teaching their children and saying, hey, when your children ask you these things, this is how you respond. It's the teaching, it's the pedagogy of the Lord that's in the household, not necessarily only from the priest or from the king. Is there a role for those groups in Israel? Yes, but it's not a unique role that you see in other places. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is absolutely fascinating. And yeah, and just, you know, just when you mentioned the shock, which I hadn't seen, of saying no to David, you know, what ancient Near Eastern culture also reminds us about the visceral earthly realities of faith. So, you know, Kings is about kings. That's about ancient Near Eastern politics and rule and government, you know, and there's a whole background to this in the ancient Near East, and it illuminates it tremendously. Kings are not just, if I can be provocative, types of Jesus. You know, they're actually political leaders who wield power, you know. So this is how Christianity and the Bible relates to all of life. Now, you know, Chip, great brother, when I listen to you, you know, and I'm sure all of us have this experience, I often think, gee, I wish I could do my education all over again. You know?
You're a young man, Craig. You still can do it.
Yeah. So I'll be signing up for your masters. But in my view, we need to nurture an emerging group of outstanding ancient Near Eastern scholars, you know, who can bring all of this, but also retain this deep interest, like yourself, in the Old Testament. Now, how would you advise students with ability and aspiration in this respect?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's a great way to think on it, a great way to get community here involved, because obviously everything needs to be done in community, especially as Christians, brothers and sisters. And so I think encouragement for those students is the first step. If you know of a student who is interested in these things, it's probably easier to tell them to go to New Testament studies or to systematic theology or to ethics. But please, if they're interested in those things, at least have them have a conversation and let me dissuade them from doing it. So, but yeah, I think having you know, knowing people that we can bring those students to and say, here are some good examples of people that are doing this from positive with positive results. They're both an expert in their ancient Near Eastern field, be that Egyptology or Assyriology or Hittitology or whatever. Go down the list, and they also know their Bible well. And so, how can we foster deep thinking and faith in these communities? So in some ways, it's no different than the communities you might find that are doing engineering or physics or art. And so, you know, how does your belief as Christians come to bear on that? You know, it means being excellent in what you do and doing all to the Lord. And so I think those are the things that are most important, obviously with great faith as well. But then the next question would be, how does that come back? How does that circle back? And I think you're right. I think we need to continue to foster and support those who are working in these areas and realize that the results aren't always going to be readily seen. You know, can we support things that we actually might disagree with to some degree because it's the furthering of knowledge? The reading about ancient deities and ancient cultures is going to kind of turn us off. I think, you know, we're reading about the polytheistic realities of the world. That could be very off-putting for us as Christians who believe in one true God. But also by reading those things, we can learn more about how it was also off-putting for the Israelites and how it was off-putting for God himself. who acts in the world. And so I think, I think all these things kind of come together. How can we foster good people is by giving them support, continuing this, and even maybe supporting that within our structures as well. Maybe your institution has a position that's going to be open, and you might actually want to hire someone in ancient Near Eastern studies to come alongside and be that sort of outsider there within your group to help with these sorts of things, and thinking about this. And anyway, so I think we have to be open to that idea as well.
No, that's wonderful. So, a bad way to attract students to ancient Near Eastern studies, but one that I've often noted is ancient Near Eastern myths are just full of sex.
Right, that's right,
So
exactly.
it's always seemed to me at an undergraduate level, this could be a recruiting mechanism, but probably a very, very bad one. But this brings us to the ancient Near Eastern world is just jam-packed with gods. I mean, there are gods everywhere in animals. I mean, Egypt is just, full of temples. And so this is so different to the modern world in which, especially in secular Europe, Africa, where I come from, is different because most people there have some faith, often Christian faith. But, here in the secular West, the notion of God, let alone the gods, is kind of taboo. Now, one of the things that struck me in all that my immersion into your world, Chip, was that I don't think I ever came across someone asking about a theology of religions and what this meant for the gods that were so real in the ancient Near East. What do you make of all these gods?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a good question to ask ourselves, is how do we deal with that in our modern context, right? As we think about entering into cultures which are polytheistic, whether that's in India or in Africa or elsewhere, where we have these sorts of structures that are not uncommon, and these structures which are returning even in Europe. And so it's not a question that is just merely about how do we deal with this from the ancient direction, but how do we deal with it in our modern world today. And so I think there is much import here within thinking about even evangelistically and missionally minded individuals within our culture. So I think for me personally, I think that I think the gods are real in many ways. We know from the witness of the biblical account that there are spiritual beings in the world, many of whom are named and many which are not. There are principalities and powers, and they oftentimes are identified in the New Testament even with idol worship. And so why would we imagine that that's the norm in the ancient world? And so why would we imagine the ancient situation is no different than that? And so that brings credence and reality to the worship that people are given. It's also giving credence to the experience that the people have that are very real with these deities, be ancient or modern. And so I think we do need to affirm these as real experiences in people's lives, but also think about ways in which we, like the Old Testament does, challenges those realities and ask, well, those there is still one true God, one God who reigns supreme, and one God of whom is unlike all others. And so, yeah, and that kind of brings it back full circle, I think, to your book in some ways as well. And how do you see sort of your approach as entering into that conversation itself? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that as well. I think you kind of foster you call it a critical realist sort of framework, and does that play into this question? How so?
Yeah, so I mean, working away on this, it just struck me as an obvious question, but one that I don't hear ancient Near Eastern scholars even discussing. And so I just wondered if when you were doing your doctorate in that, was this ever a topic of discussion or not?
Not really. I mean, I think maybe the closest you could get to it would be like Jan Osman, who talks about explicit theology. I think he talks about it. So he's an Egyptology specialist, has done work in in biblical texts as well. And so, and I think he talks about the difference between implicit and explicit theology. And I think that explicit theology, the sort of the speaking of truths, like the way that are like directive and programmatic, versus implicit, which is more sort of this like narrative or the oriented reality. I think he's maybe the closest we get to that. But I think most of the time we're looking at sociological frameworks, anthropological frameworks of thinking about Israelite religion or other things like that, that are certain cognitive perspectives, which can bring a lot of interesting information to bear, but it doesn't seem to be engaging with the sort of very real component of the belief in these deities. And what
Yeah.
does that then mean for the believers?
Yeah, so I mean, also, I think this is an area that needs a lot more exploration, and so I think that missional studies can help us here, but of course they would need to be into the work of ancient Near Eastern studies, where religion can be distorted but still have very important insights. So if I think of Newbegin's work and so on and so forth, of course, you also have I'm thinking Jeremiah keeps popping into my head because of his polemic,
Yes.
against these handmade idols and so on and so forth. But I think it would be a mistake just to write off, I think the modern approach as well, what interesting stories, but they're fairy tales,
Yeah.
Whereas I think the numinous and the experience of the divine is profound. And I think to take ancient Near Eastern culture seriously without wrestling with this is a terrible mistake, So I would think, but I think if one can see that religion can be real and there's something going on there, but also distorted, then I think it also allows you to have a look at the Egyptian worldview or the Assyrian worldview or the Babylonian worldview, and to say there are distortions here, but also tremendously important insights. And then your engagement with these cultures, which I think is what you have going on in the Old Testament. I mean, it incorporates insights. The thing that fascinates me, Israel is a real latecomer in the ancient Near East. She doesn't have any pyramids or phenomenal architecture. Writing has already been around for ages and so on. So it's so intriguing to me that this is God's way with his world, that he puts this nation or develops this nation late in the history of the ancient Near East, right in the middle of the superpowers of the day. It's like all their highways are sort of running across the land of Israel. And it's, whereas Egypt, for example, is isolated by her geography. So she's able to pretend that, really nothing exists outside her.
Right.
But Israel could never pretend that.
Yeah.
So she's forced into this profound engagement with the cultures of the day.
And it's an engagement from the margins, isn't it? And so it's in many ways it echoes what we see happen later in the church as well. Is that God goes to the weak and the vulnerable and the ones that are always in threat, and says, let me offer myself to you. And that's what he does in Israel. I think for many Bible readers that grow up reading the Bible, there's still a few of us out there. We read the Bible and we think Israel is this great nation and this wonderful kingdom and all these great things. We think of the Solomonic era where it's just conquered everything and it's just this big. But what in reality, and maybe this is another place where ancient Near Eastern studies can help us, is that Israel serves as a much smaller player on the landscape of the geopolitics of the ancient world. Israel is the Kuwait in the Gulf War in the 90s. The one that's situated between multiple great powers and is being jostled back and forth at every turn and being used for someone else's ends, right? And that's what we see within the record of the Bible. But yet, that's also the people that God decides to use, because they are the very ones who could speak the language of each of these groups, both in positive ways and in negative ways, right? To both affirm the truths within the religions that are there and subvert the places where those religions have gone astray from believing in Yahweh God.
So this is really amazing, Chip. So, I mean, I hear a missional theology of Israel, just emerging, which is incredibly rich, and we need now our time for our dialogue, and what's excited me is I could see this going on for hours and I would get more and more excited. But so I just want us to finish with two questions. So the one is you asked me about the critical realist framework. So I just want to make a few comments on that. And this may scare some of the listeners, but this is my argument that Old Testament studies needs philosophy. Now, before you fall off your chair or leave the Zoom, please just let me explain why I think this is so important. So I've said that there are three areas in Old Testament texts that really require attention: the literary, the historical, and the charismatic or theological. Now, if you try and focus in on those, you're soon going to back yourself into the following sort of questions. Well, what is literature? Okay, what is history? And of course, then what is theology could be another question. But let's just take those first two questions. What is literature, and hence the literary nature of the text? What is history? Now, anyone who has studied history or literature in the last 25, 30 years will know that there isn't one answer in the academy nowadays to those questions. There are literally hundreds of answers. Mm-hmm. So, you know, postmodernism has surfaced this like nothing else. And literary studies was very central to postmodernism and spreading it to all the other disciplines. So if you want to work out what literature is, then you're going to have to say, well, there are all these different views. I mean, which one should I be using? And the answer is that underlying those views of literature are bigger questions that ultimately are philosophical and religious questions. So what you would need is some kind of sense from a Christian philosophical perspective, I suggest, of what literature is. Now, some of you may say, well, this sounds terribly esoteric. Let me just give you one example why it's not. So Chip will know far better than I do that one of the hottest areas in Old Testament study today is textual criticism. And I try and address this, however inadequately, in the Old Testament and God. But some people are arguing that actually there is no such thing as the Old Testament text, that the transmission process is unbelievably complex, it's fluid all the way down, and as far back as we go, there are multiple versions in existence. Now, what amazed me when I, with taking a deep breath and very reluctantly plunged into this, you soon come across views of the nature of literature. What is a text? And these are profoundly philosophical and ultimately religious questions. So I don't think you can get away without philosophy. And I think with a paradigm shift, you have to explore this. And I've followed Tom Wright in proposing a critical realist framework, which goes as follows. There is a real discernible shape to the world, or in our case, there is a real discernible shape to the Old Testament. That's the realist part of critical realist. It's out there, it resists just being turned into a wax nose, it can be known and it can be analyzed. The critical part is that different scholars bring different worldviews or perspectives to their study of that which can be known. That's critical realism. And so, of course, what I'm trying to clear the room for is bringing my Christian basic beliefs, which Alvin Plantinga and others tell me I don't need first to justify, I can assume them, right into the heart of the most rigorous work I can do on the Old Testament, while absolutely defending the right of other people, of other persuasions, to bring different frameworks to their study of the Old Testament. But the point I would vigorously fight over, everyone has a framework. It's not just religious folk who have frameworks, everyone has a framework. Or to put it another way, ultimately everyone is religious. So the critical realist thing is an important component. And let me just say this as well, that framework could be filled out in different Christian philosophical approaches. This is broad brushstroke work, but I think important and helpful. Okay, Chip, I think we'll ask. Sorry, you comment, and then we'll
Well,
ask.
I was going to ask you one more question if we have time for it. Is
Yeah,
that okay?
yeah.
So how does then that come into this idea that you posit in the book that of divine action in the world? So we've developed this framework. You've talked about the ways in which the kind of the setting, if you want, the garb of God in the ancient world, and then now you say, and God acts in the world. And I think for some people they would say, well, okay, sure, yeah, I mean, what's the problem? But you said at the top of our call here too that that's a taboo. You use that word in modern Old Testament studies. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to kind of push on that a little bit farther.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let me give an example which may be helpful. So I won't name names, but a very prominent British Old Testament scholar and ancient Near Eastern scholar, was writing about the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and he would simply say, well, no one believes anymore that God said, and this has become the sort of de facto way in which Old Testament scholarship operates, that just as Egyptian myths are fanciful stories that we can ignore and get on with the real stuff, so the Old Testament depiction of God as the living God, the God who acts and speaks, we might take that, might find that interesting as a literary motif or phenomenon, but we can't possibly, if we want to do scientific work on the Bible, even imagine the possibility of God speaking and acting in the world. So now, of course, evangelicals don't do that, but I'm not sure that they haven't themselves been quite well shaped by the mainstream in being very cautious on this. So, what I'm wanting to argue, and of course, I'm so sad that he died recently, but I got to know Billy Abraham in Chicago, and we hit it off, and he's just recently had finished 4 volumes with Oxford University Press on divine action. And, he says, that we've got to come off the contraceptive pill. This is his language. That, we've been given by Old Testament studies and theology, which forbids and prevents, pregnancy with divine action. I mean, divine action is at the heart of Christian belief, that there is this living God, that he's the creator, redeemer, that he holds the world into existence, that he acts within the world. And so now, what I don't want to do is to rush to a fundamentalist position to say, okay, I've got it all. And what I do is I draw on Christoph Schwabel's very sophisticated understanding of revelation. And the crucial point is, for revelation to be successful, it requires human appropriation. So you need an Israel to say yes, however much they fail to keep that promise. In the New Testament, you need the authentic witness of first century Jewish disciples, which forms the basis of the New Testament. And of course, that reception is supervised by the Spirit, but organic, it's wonderfully human, it's messy. So that means that the way in which we get these texts may well be very complex with all sorts of processes and sources involved. So my approach is no rush to fundamentalism, but it is absolutely to say, like God said to David, no, we will allow God to be taken with full seriousness amidst the glory, which, I mean, Chip, just speaking to you, it makes me want to really to come and do the MA in Semitic Studies with you and just, wallow in this world with a view to opening up scripture in fresh ways.